Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast after a little break. And I'm very pleased to welcome back Rana Ghoneim, who is the head of Energy Systems and the Decarbonization Unit at the UN's Industrial Development Organization. And the first time, Rana, that you and I spoke to each other was pretty much a year ago, because it was just ahead of the COP in Glasgow and the launch of the Green Public Procurement Pledge. But before we dive into an update, for those people that didn't hear that episode, could you just give us a bit of a sense of who you are and how have you come to be doing this work in this space?
Yeah, well, hi. Thanks, Alex, for having me again on this podcast. And it's a pleasure to see you again. I'm, as you say, Rana Ghoneim. I had the division for Energy Systems and Industrial Decarbonization at UNIDO. And of course, it's been a journey. I've been always environmentally conscious, as a child growing up in Lebanon, and I've always wanted to see, how can we transform the world, and not just to bring climate justice, but also to ensure that we support countries like Lebanon to develop further, because it's also part of all developing countries' interests to move towards more industrialized economies. But then, we don't need to support industrialized economies and grow emissions. And this is an area that I find very fascinating. How do we decouple that growth from emissions? How do we provide prosperity for people in developing countries without really adversely affecting our climate? And, so it's this drive to both help countries develop and at the same time tackle challenges like climate change that really brought me to where I am today, and very happy to be within my role championing some of the global initiatives that are challenging governments to do better on climate programs.
And you come into the Decarb Connect world because we intersect on this idea of green procurement and how essential it is. It's no surprise to you or to listeners that one of the things we hear about the most from industry is we can do this work, we can do the decarbonisation. Yes, it's possible, we can spend on it, but who is going to be willing to pay for the green products on the other end, because it will cost more to produce them. And obviously this is what your program is all about, this Green Public Procurement Pledge. And as I mentioned at the beginning, launched last year at COP. So maybe our starting point is, how did that go? And what have you seen happen in the last year or so?
So we've just maybe a bit of a recap. So we've identified public procurement for steel and cement as one of the key levers for creating change for the adoption of new technologies to decarbonize these sectors. And primarily because in the countries that are already members of our Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative and the Green Public Procurement Pledge, already at COP26, we had Germany, UK, Canada, UAE, as well as India. In these countries, green procurement or procurement is responsible for 25 to 40% of the volumes of steel and cement that are going to public construction projects and others as well. So this is a very strong lever. What we also see is that while the technology costs upstream for the adoption of green hydrogen, let's say in steel making, are quite high and significant, if you look at the downstream cost, for example, for a house or for a car, this is really less than 1% of the value of that house or the value of that car. And so this is why, if you look at it this way, it's really the green premium is minimal. And what we are calling on is that procurement does not need to look only at the cost, because the cost of the issues that come to the climate, to the health of people, this should all be built in. And if you add that into your equation in looking at procurement programs, then it shouldn't be only the cost that weighs what decisions are made, but there's also needs to be these other parameters that would make obviously the scale move more towards the greener products.
So it's kind of interesting when you think about the timeline of all these things that were happening at COP last year, because one of the other kind of announcements that was happening alongside yours was about the First Movers Coalition. And we've seen in the last year, First Movers Coalition, steelzero, concretezero, these other green procurement enablers, maybe I'll phrase it that way, kind of come online. What's your perspective on that? Do you see that these programs, are they able to work together? Are there kind of collaborations or support opportunities between them? Tell me a bit about how has that kind of woven into the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. I mean, what we focus on is the public procurement piece. So really challenging governments to adopt targets for green procurement, be it by setting baselines already for 2025 of how much do they actually spend on procurement, and how much embodied carbon is entailed in all the different public procurement projects, setting interim targets for 2030, setting or aligning the 2050 procurement goals with the net zero goals, and so on and so forth. And basically, it's not enough for, so First Movers Coalition brings together a number of companies that are making these commitments, and of course, countries that are endorsing and these commitments and looking at how to support these companies further. But what we are bringing in is actually more the country's own commitment. So the two go hand in hand together, as long as we work together on more harmonized definitions for what is low carbon steel, what is low carbon cement, and what are the reasonable targets for public as well as for private. And this is actually the collaboration that we nurture with initiatives like FMC, like steelzero, working closely with IDDI and bringing them on board of our working groups. And similarly, you know, whenever they are looking at certain definitions, you know, this is an exchange that is already happening across the initiative. So we recognize that for us to create a more sustainable demand for low carbon steel and low carbon cement, we really need to be giving a more harmonized picture to the market and also more common approaches. So really happy to see all this coming together, because just like governments have that power, also private sector companies and construction companies, which steelzero brings a lot of those as well. You know, this is how you create a market effect across different segments of the market, and not just government or private sector or so on.
Yeah, and within that, I guess there's 2 or 3 points I'll pick up on. I'll pick up on, you mentioned this kind of harmonization of the language and the definitions that we use. We'll come on to that a little later, because I am interested in this difference that we start to hear between low carbon and near zero, and different terminology coming up, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's come back then to the interim targets that you just mentioned in brief. Obviously that was the big takeaway from Pittsburgh, and your time there was announcing how the kind of the Green Public Procurement Pledge is going to put in place, or has put in place, these 2030 interim targets. Can you talk a little more about that? Because obviously, I guess if you're going to be a cynic in the world of public sector anything, the cynics hear about pledges and they just think, well, that's words. And of course, the 2030 interim targets is what really starts to make it much more real, isn't it, and kind of tangible. So talk us through what that announcement was and what we should expect to see coming out of those discussions.
So there's two folds to that announcement. One is actually a commitment from the countries that are part of this Green Public Procurement Pledge to undertake national consultations and commit towards the procurement of near zero technologies for key projects. You know, and we're going to be working on the definition of what are these key projects, and essentially what it is, it's trying to stimulate new innovations in energy technologies that could help decarbonize the sector. And we want governments to already make these commitments today, and to make sure that some of these technologies are in the market before 2030, because, you know, we would be reaching that tipping point if we don't start acting today on creating those new innovative technologies. So that's the first part of it. And then the second piece is, if we don't start implementing today at a more commercial scale some of the existing technologies like hydrogen and CCUS and others, then we're also going to be reaching that tipping point. So this is the second tier of that pledge, where also countries are committing to undertake a consultation on an interim target for low carbon steel and low carbon cement in construction projects. And there we're very much heavily relying on the IEA methodology for the definition of low carbon steel, where there's different bands for low carbon steel, and every country is going to be different. We're challenging countries to be as ambitious as possible, depending on their national circumstances. But sometimes it wouldn't be fair to put in the same category as well countries that have this access to the cutting edge technologies and countries that are just starting on that pathway. So this is where we are challenging countries to really come back to us and say which bands are those that could be applicable to them, and those that they could actually also accomplish. So I know it's kind of vague, and probably people are going to be saying, is this ambitious enough? I mean, we are challenging countries to go to band A if they can, but we just also have to make sure that we don't set it as band A and just have one government or two that are committing to that. We want to really bring more countries on board. And how do we? So essentially, the work starts now. To be fair, we've had all this work in discussing and agreeing on a pledge language that would be agreeable to a number of countries, and we've brought in expert views from industry, from academia, and various experts. But now that we have the pledge, our work as well as the Secretariat of this Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative is how to set up now the reporting on against this pledge. How do we monitor that actually things are on track, and how do we come back to all the public and really announce the impacts that this has created? So it's a lot of preparatory work so far, and I know that moving forward, our biggest task is to really ensure that these are not just words, but actually actions that governments carry forward, and that we would kind of monitor and return to everyone with.
So between now and, let's say, the first few thousand tons of green steel or green cement being bought and used in projects in these countries, the main work, is it more about getting this discussion within country, or is there something else that is another kind of key hurdle, would you say? Like if I'm a green cement producer, or I have a green steel product, if I were looking at this, I'd be thinking, well, this is great. This sounds amazing. This is just what we need. But when is it going to get to a point where my product is being bought? So there's a few questions in there. There's a classic Alex Cameron podcast question, isn't it? But what are the hurdles between now and that reality?
So indeed, we've given the countries now almost 9 months, 12 months to go and do that consultation, bring all the stakeholders nationally to really define what that. So if you're an industry representative from any of the countries that have committed to this Green Public Procurement Pledge, be involved in these consultations, because that's your platform to make sure that the most ambitious goal is achieved. And when would it start resulting? So there's a couple of things that we still need to get in place before it's really getting towards those investments, because the first year of the pledge that I mentioned is actually the requirement to require disclosure on embodied carbon on public construction projects in 2025, because that's like the baseline. That's what is going to help us where we stand. And there's a bit of work that we could do still to track data on, how much is being spent on these type of projects, how much is going to these commodities as well, how much of these commodities are being used. So sort of a lot of work to really get also the countries to better understand where their expenditures on public procurement are. And so this is where also, I would see a bit of our work over the coming year. And then I would say probably starting 2026 or so, this is when we're going to see that maybe materializing as well into contracts. So it does seem like it's a number of years from now, but in reality, these are really large infrastructure projects, and for them to be realized as well, I think the industry is essentially not going to be ready either to supply this quantity before then. So I would tend to think that, as I'm an optimist, that is even an optimistic scenario, or more where I would like to see things heading. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? When you're someone like me, I don't work within, you know, the public sector sphere. So on the one hand, does that sound like a long timeline? Well, of course, but the flip side is you're laying strong foundations. That's the point here, isn't it? Is having real foundations on which green materials markets can sit. And that points about actually having the technology and the data reporting in place so that we can monitor those commitments. I mean, yes, because otherwise all you've got is a commitment, maybe some procurement, but no real measurement of the real impact. Let me ask a different question then. So the kind of key point of why is green public procurement so important? It is partly the sheer volume of government spend on this, but it is because of that volume, this can be the market creation moment, right? This is the way to start bringing down the cost of those materials. When you're talking to your pledge group and the people that you're hoping to bring into it, what do they say about the current state of the green premium, you know, the reality of the cost to them? How do you talk with them about that? How do we get over that hump of just, this is going to cost more initially, but you are a big player in what's going to make the cost come down? How do those conversations go?
I mean, I have to say that the countries we're speaking to are the first movers on this, so they are convinced in it and in the power of this, and the fact that, you know, that there needs to be a green premium paid by, and that the governments probably have that responsibility to bear it, and so I would say though that on the side of this, you know, a lot of skepticism sometimes in talking to some other experts, saying, okay, but this is taxpayers' money, like why, you know, at the end of the day, why should we use the taxpayers' money to really pay for that green premium? So, and there, I think I'd like to go back to where I started. This is just like, we really need to integrate the broader, you know, the multiple benefits and the multiple costs as well. So that it relates to if we continue the business as usual, and if you weigh all this in, you know, I'm quite sure that, you know, the green premium would be negligible in comparison to all the costs that it's, you know, putting forward also on the other side to reduce and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So yeah, the governments we're talking to are the first movers, and luckily they're on board and committed to see how do we help them make the economic case for this. And to those that don't think that or governments should bear that green premium, I would just say we need to look at costs in a different way and sort of weigh all of these in, and then sort of look at whether this green premium is something significant.
So slightly different question for you then. I mean, even, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that a pandemic could have an impact on decarbonisation and these sorts of plans. A year ago, we probably didn't think that a war or an energy crisis could, you know, would come and have such an impact on all sorts of things in industry. What's your sense of the kind of the war in Ukraine, the spike in energy prices, and does this act as an incentive to carry on with this work? Does it act as more of a block when you're talking to this pledge class of these first movers? What's your sense of like the current context and how that's a pro or a con to the work that you're trying to do?
I mean, industry is the first to be affected in any of these, crises, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's like a shortage in energy supply, and their business, their day-to-day operations are going to be affected. Their competitiveness is going to be affected. If they don't secure that energy supply, and maybe this is the moment as well when industry starts feeling that we really need to shift because of energy security and energy supply purposes, and so I would hope that this is something that's going to be positive and influencing industries and government support to industry to actually take that move sooner than later, because really it is, at the end of the day, in my view, an opportunity. And actually, living in Austria now, I'm just like very happy to see that for the first time sourcing my energy from renewables is actually cheaper. So how do we make use of such a positive thing that happened now, although we're talking about security of supply for winter and the spiking in prices, but how can we use that to actually influence also on the longer term the behavior and switching of end users, basically, at the end of the day, be it in industry or others, to really take that sustainable path, because that sustainable path is the more resilient one, is the more secure one, and is also on the long run like the more cost competitive one. So yeah, I think that's really where I would like to see change happen.
Okay, well, before I close out, there's a question I just want to come back to, which is around, you talked at the beginning or early in the conversation about the need for harmonization of language. And we hear this in all parts of the decarbonisation discussion, whether you're talking about EU policy or how companies talk to each other about their own targets. Specifically, I'm interested in the low carbon and near zero terminology that sort of come up this year. What is the difference between that? What does that really mean? And what does it mean to your, the pledges in this gathering?
Yeah. So essentially, low carbon is more has to do with the deployment of technologies that we have today at hand, and that could bring down the embodied carbon in certain commodities and reduce that to a certain level. And that level, for example, for steel, that's where I would look at the IEA report and the different bands that they've introduced. So depending on the different emissions, depending on the different technologies that are being used, but it's really mostly about using technologies we have today. And the near zero is just more about pushing innovative technologies that could help go beyond the low carbon ones, and that could help also in achieving our net zero goals in 2050. So that's how I would just explain slightly the difference. But of course, I mean, if we want to enter into the technical details of both, I think it's going to be, a lot more, debatable, let's say, between experts and all. But that's how I would just generally distinguish the two, and that's how we sort of try to create this push and pull through the initiative for existing technologies that need this commercialization and new innovative technologies that we need to bring to the market and help in influencing that.
Okay, and then just as a sort of a closeout thought, I suppose, what is it that needs to happen next? You talked about this need to talk within countries, within states, about how this can work, how to move it forward, and that's something that those first movers in the pledge have got to do next. But what else needs to happen? What needs to accelerate for this to really kind of shift into the gear of deployment and the real kind of procurement phase? Is there anything else that we as constituents, we as industrialists should be doing to help accelerate this?
Well, a number of things really. First and foremost, that's probably on our side more, but also probably, applying more pressure. More governments need to join this. At the moment, we're very excited. US joined at the meeting we had in Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago. The US joined IDDI, Saudi Arabia as well, Japan as well. Actually, just informed us last week also that they would like to join. So, we need the ball to roll a bit faster and for more countries to join. Second is, I think we need to move this conversation. It's at the moment very centered on the North. We need to also bring in the South and the South voices a lot more, because we want to avoid and we want to make sure that that next factory with yesterday's technology is not going and to be established somewhere in Africa or in developing countries. So we need to really foster that discussion very much with the South, and that's where I'm looking at COP27 as a good, stepping stone, with Egypt hosting the COP. It's an African COP. We really hope that that is part of the discussion as well, and we've worked on that as with the partners. And then, the third thing is, how do we bring these investments? I mean, industries, how do we bring these talk to us as well. Let us know, how can we help create the frameworks to bring those investments, and how can we again make sure that these investments are also happening in India and others, and not just those couple of planned investments that are already ongoing. So how do we go deeper? I guess it's not just about faster, but how do we go deeper also, and really bring in more countries, more global South countries, and also more companies.
Yeah, well, we'll be interested to hear how your COP goes, because I think the kind of that shift to it being very much the African, or certainly Middle East and African COP is important, isn't it? A different kind of lens than perhaps Glasgow was able to bring. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts after that. But Rana, thank you so much for coming back and giving us a little of your time. It's really fascinating to hear how something of this scale, this kind of a mobilization of such at-scale procurement power, interesting to hear how it works in reality, but also really when you think about the scale of the governments already involved, those coming on board, it is moving at quite a pace. It's just, yeah, fascinating. So congratulations. It may not always feel like that, but it's very interesting to hear about. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, let's keep that moving. And I really hope that we have more results, not just centered around COPs, but really keeping track of where we are at the end of the day, where we need to be.
Great. Well, safe travels to Egypt, and hope to catch up with you again before too long.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.